Hi everyone, this is Alex Sheen, founder of Because I Said I Would, on week 48 of 52 promises. It's crazy to think that there are only 4 weeks left in this year-long promise to volunteer at a different nonprofit organization every week. And this week was unique for a couple of different reasons. The first one is that I actually volunteered for Because I Said I Would as a nonprofit organization this week. And you might think to yourself that it's sort of an easy way out, right? To volunteer for the nonprofit organization that I run and I'm a part of. But this week was not easy. It was probably the hardest week for a few different reasons. I decided that I would volunteer in Ferguson, Missouri, to help in some of the recovery efforts that have resulted after the destruction of property and the protests that happened in that city. Amanda helped me in this promise to volunteer on Thanksgiving, and that's the day that I spent there. We drove through the night, starting at about 9:30 p.m. on Wednesday of this week, and drove the 8.5 to 9 hours down to the St. Louis, Missouri area. We got there, were able to sleep for a little bit, and then I headed into Ferguson. I was actually driving, and Amanda was in the passenger seat, and I'm unfamiliar with the area, obviously, and so I was going like 44 and a 30 or a 35 or something to this effect, and I got pulled over by a cop. We were about 5 or 3 miles away from Ferguson, and they're processing my ticket, which I deserved. But I asked the officer as he was tying up if he knew of any efforts that I could help with to volunteer and help out to clean, fix, paint, what have you. And he just said to me, don't go in there. Unless you have big guns, you got no business being in there. I'd turn around if I were you. I made the commitment, so I have to stick with it. And I didn't want to sort of drag Amanda into the situation that this police officer described. So I turned the car around and went back to the hotel. I left Amanda there and then drove into Ferguson alone. Now, is a part of, I guess, what the news is playing that is quite true. The area is horrible. Everything is boarded up. It seems for miles in that city, just on these particular main thoroughfares, these main roads in Ferguson, it's all boarded up. And I guess I've never seen something like that. But not only does that sort of jar you a little bit, but they're just buildings just burnt to the ground, just bombed out buildings laying in this rubble. When I first got there, I really wasn't connected with another organization. I thought I would just find an effort to clean up a local business or any sort of community center, something I thought would pop up, but it really wasn't happening. And so I just went into a grocery store and I asked a couple people if they knew of anywhere that I could help out, and it was just sort of coming up dry. So I went back into my car and continued to drive around Ferguson until I saw this family just painting boarded up windows, and I thought that looked like a great effort to beautify the city that has been affected so deeply. And so I pulled over, parked, I came by, and ended up being the family's their last name was Bailey, so the Baileys. They opened their arms and said, hey, yeah, you can help. And they had a bunch of paint. Their 2 kids were actually painting this dragon on a Chinese restaurant. They already had approval from the building manager to help paint this building. And I went with Lou, the dad. He actually got in my car, and we went back to his house, which was just up the road. Then I gathered some supplies. I met their dog, and we drove back, and I started to paint. They needed to leave because this was on Thanksgiving Day. They needed to leave to go have Thanksgiving as a family, which is awesome. And so I sort of took over, began painting this really large, about 60-foot side of this Chinese restaurant that was just all boarded up. As I was doing this, there were a lot of people there, sort of, but not in a way that you might think. It was like just all reporters. There was a group of people, maybe 3 or 4 people, half block down. They were also painting, but everybody else, I mean, it was just news. Reporters kept asking you questions, and I'm trying to paint, but that's sort of discouraging. I mean, I know it's Thanksgiving, so people have to spend time with their family. They want to spend time with their family. People deserve that. But, I just expected more to be happening in the community of Ferguson. There were no rioters. There were no protesters on this day, and you can, check the news for kind of validation on that. It was really calm. And I was really inspired. I'd love to see this family out there just by themselves. It really spoke to me, because you got to look back at the reason why I even decided to, get up off the couch to drive down to Ferguson. I found myself complaining. About looters, just people taking advantage of this tragedy, of this situation, of this tension to just destroy, to take advantage of this loss and to steal with that. I am a deep believer in protesting, a deep believer in the freedom of speech and the right to assemble, but we should not leverage those rights and the pain and the suffering and the loss of the Brown family to just destroy and steal. I feel that is so wrong. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. looked up to Gandhi, and both of those men would not condone the type of violence, the type of hate, the type of destruction that has come to Ferguson, Missouri, and it's a shame. And so, to see the Bailey family out there was just such an incredible thing. I was just done sitting in Ohio complaining about this situation, complaining about what I'm seeing on the news, and so I decided to spend my Thanksgiving doing what little I could in this volunteer effort. So as the Bailey family went to their Thanksgiving and enjoyed time as a family, I started painting and painted this really large wall of boarded up windows. A guy, Chris, just some stranger, pulled off the side of the road and asked if he could help, and of course I said he could. He was from about 25-30 miles away, and he started painting as well. We primed about 60 feet across of these boarded up windows so that the kids could come back and actually paint some designs and things that I'm just really not good at. I'm not artistic even in the slightest bit. But there was one piece of the wall that I wanted to put a message on. It was a Chinese restaurant, and there's sort of a proverb, a quote from Lao Tzu, and it's a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. It's a quote, a thought that recognizes that a road commitment, even something like recovery, is not gonna happen at once, and you've got to make that first step. And to me, I believe that's symbolic of a promise in general. Sometimes that first step in achieving a promise, a commitment that we set out, it takes the promise itself to be that step. It takes a commitment for us to move forward in a direction, and I was glad that I could have a space just to write something. But at the instructions of the Bailey family, I left the rest of the paint and supplies there at about 6 p.m. They came, I think, at 7. They sent me a text message about the wall. Later on the next day, they sent me some more of the designs and things that they had completed, and it was just awesome to see that progress. The night that I finished up my volunteering, Thanksgiving night, the National Guard were out in significant numbers. There were Humvees across the city and parking lots of businesses and entrances of roads. There was a major road. West Florissant was cut off by police and these officers. It was it really felt like a war scene. You know, what do I know about that type of situation, that type of place? I know nothing of war, but it was very foreign to me to see this state in our own country. The next day, Amanda and I were to head back to Cleveland, Ohio, to get back to lives as usual, which is not something that they can do in Ferguson, unfortunately. There's still a lot of rebuilding, a lot of tension to smooth out, and just so much for that community to rebound from. I just wish them the very best. You know, on the way out, I text the Bailey family. I text Lou and said that I wanted to drop some things off, just, you know, because I said I would, t-shirts, a wristband, just stuff to show our appreciation from the social movement, that these individuals, even though they weren't joined by hundreds, it's just a family and a couple neighbors, that they were willing to make that promise and that commitment to stick with this cleanup effort. And I met them at about 10 a.m. On Friday after Thanksgiving in this parking lot, and there was just news people everywhere looking at this family, and because they were going to go up to West Florissant Avenue, I believe, and address the police officers in a very peaceful way to say, we're not here to protest, we're not here to do anything but clean up. And we have brooms and we have buckets and we have the supplies to help some of these business owners start the recovery process, and they just wanted to be let into this major avenue to help provide some of that support. And so really not a political statement so much as one of community and volunteerism. And I felt bad. I felt bad because I needed to drive back. I felt bad that I couldn't stay and help more. I felt bad that this family and a couple neighbors, I mean, that's it. I felt bad that they didn't have more people with them. And you feel guilty sometimes. You feel guilty that in life you can't commit yourself to everything, that you sort of choose your battles, you break out your time, you do as much as you can. You feel bad. But, you know, I came and I painted my wall. I primed it. I put in my hours. So this week I volunteered for the social movement and nonprofit organization because I said I would. And I want to make one last point in why I selected us for this week. When you look at Because I Said I Would, from its very origin in the loss of my father, when you look at the promises that I made in the beginning and those that others followed with, we are really a social movement of independent individuals, all around the same cause, the importance of a promise, the betterment of humanity through our commitments. Yes, this is true, but we are all independent in our promises. And this has made a significant impact, I believe this. But what if instead of independent promises, what if we were to make the same promise? What if instead of just me showing up in Ferguson, what if it was 10,000 people making that same promise from the social movement from across the United States? What if one day, Because I Said I Would, grew into 1 million people who could make a promise together, a unified commitment, a unified act of kindness, an act of honor, an act of volunteerism? What if we could make that promise together? We have never done this as a social movement. We have always acted independently, but one day I believe that we can be called and should be called to action to help those in need. This is my hope for what Because I Said I Would will become as a social movement. And while this volunteer opportunity was just myself and just Amanda, perhaps one day we will be joined by thousands.